We're starting with carbon management, the Management Forum, and our first speaker is Matt Dracup of Energy, who's the Energy Services Director at NG, not ONG, NG. Okay, Matt.
So, good afternoon. Thank you, Eddie. So I'm Matt Dracup. I'm the Industrial Energy Services Director at NG, which is why I'm here. We do have another one. I'm not the only Energy Services Director. We have a commercial one as well, who looks after office buildings and things like that. But my team very much are industrial specialists, and we deliver energy management services for manufacturing mainly. So I'm going to talk to you less about policy and more about the practicality of reducing carbon and that side of management, because yes, there are lots of policies out there. I know my colleague here is going to talk about ESOS and streamlined energy and carbon reporting, but I want to talk really about how to actually reduce carbon through those schemes as well. So I work for NG. NG changed quite a lot last year. We changed our structure. We're a big energy and services business. We acquired Keepmoat Regeneration, so we do regeneration as well. I don't know anything about that, to be honest, but the energy and services bit is where I work, and it's kind of between the energy and services. So we're an energy supplier, as you probably know, and we're a big FM company as well. And what we're trying to do is integrate those two things, because they can complement each other, and I'll talk a bit more about that. So in terms of our energy management approach, we also acquired somebody called Smart Buildings Limited last year, because we're very aware and keen to move forward into the energy analytics and Internet of Things side of things. So Smart Buildings Limited is all about controlling of all your assets, getting all the data back and being able to control that. And that sits in the energy analytics bit. So we get all the data back, get a much deeper understanding of how you actually use energy. And that data isn't just about the actual consumption. It's not just from meters. It's also about the scheduling of people and equipment, and how that affects things. And it really boils down to what's driving your energy consumption. And it's not just about energy data. I primarily work in the energy efficiency solutions bit, so we're all about actually identifying and implementing those projects and actually creating those savings. And then the asset management bit is the FM side of it. And if you manage your assets efficiently, it's not just about buying new pieces of kit. It's when you get those pieces of kit, making sure you operate them correctly, maintain them correctly to maintain the highest efficiency possible. So, as I said, I run the Industrial Energy Services team. We're a team of engineers. We also deal with the compliance side at ESOS, ISO 50001, etc. But because we're engineers, we like to build things. We do energy audits, but that's really the starting point for us. And that's really the message I wanted to get across today. Especially, it's quite topical this year. Everyone's got to do ESOS audits. The amount of feedback I got from the last ESOS where it's not helped us in any way whatsoever, it's just a compliance thing, and we've not saved any energy. And it's a fair point, but it depends how you do it. And that's why I want to talk about it today, because ESOS is a starting point, and regardless of ESOS, energy audit is a starting point. It's not, right, we've done the audit, we know what to do, because then you've got to do it. And that's where a lot of people fall down. Everyone says, we go and see clients and they say, don't tell me you're going to do another energy audit. I've got 8 of them in my drawer, and they've not saved me any energy. So we'll just skip through this. These are the sort of things we do. In terms of carbon management schemes, we're talking about Ofgem and BEIS. I'll not go too much into the BEIS side of things because, as I say, my friend's going to talk about that slightly later. Ofgem, these are more incentives as opposed to policies. So these are really to drive renewable side of things. And to a certain extent, they've worked. I think the other side of it, from BEIS, they are frameworks in which you can manage your energy better, and that's the spirit of these things. People talk about the spirit of ESOS is to reduce your consumption, but everybody's seeing it as just a compliance that they've got to do, another compliance. But the other thing is, I suppose, this year, is that things are changing quite a lot. So CRC's going, that's being replaced with streamlined energy and carbon reporting. The costs on CCL are going up, on gas and electricity. So it's becoming a bit more complex. There's obviously cost increases for various different reasons. One being the third-party costs just incrementally keep going up. But second of all, I know a lot has been talked about today around the wholesale side of it. Quite a few businesses are having a bit of a shock if they're renewing energy contracts recently. That if they bought in 2015-16, it was quite cheap. And now some businesses are seeing sort of 20-30% increases in some cases. The other thing we see a lot of is resource is a problem. So, I'll give you a very good example. We do work with Carlsberg, and Carlsberg have an energy manager there called James, who's a really good engineer, very good energy manager, and we've got a contract. We supply them with gas and electricity, and as part of that, we supply them with an energy services fund. And we say, right, you've got £60,000 to do whatever you want with energy management, and we'll help you do it. So I went to sit with James, and he said what I said before: don't do me another energy audit. Don't need one, don't want one. I know exactly all the things that I need to do on this site. I've been here since I was a boy. Okay, and I said, fair enough. And he went through all the things, and I said, you're absolutely right. I can't tell you what you need to do. But what he does need is resource. He's one energy manager on a big site that's busy. He's got no project management resource, and he's got no technical resource to develop these projects. So we actually provided him with one of my technical energy managers for 6 months. Oh, and he had a target, a personal target, to get the site ISO 50001 by the end of last year, which we did for him as well. But that was his point, is that most people know what they need to do now, because we did ESOS in 2015. Energy audits were around before ESOS. People know it's high on the agenda. It's more about resource and actually getting a plan in place to do it. Funding can be an issue, although there are quite a lot of products on the market that allow you to get third-party financing for these things, and they become self-funding. But a lot of businesses need help, and energy audits will not save you energy. It's the bit after that. Okay, so what we're trying to do really is take that energy audit as step one and move forward into reviewing what you've got and having a more intelligent approach around which projects you do and the order that you do them in. So that's part of the strategy. And I think one of the things that hasn't had the take-up that I thought it would have is ISO 50001. Because all the different policies and compliance issues now, streamlined energy and carbon reporting, ESOS, general energy management, ISO 50001 is not just another management system. It's a good one. It works. I've not met a business yet that's got ISO 50001 and don't save energy on an annual basis. It is a good system, and it sort of forces you to save energy. But what we're doing, really, is part of the audit. You're obviously getting your data back, understanding how you use it, patterns of use, drivers, mapping where all your energy goes. This should all be in your ESOS audit if the people that are doing it are good at it. But then you take from that a list of opportunities. You will get, as standard in an ESOS audit or energy audit, a list of all the things that they found. More often than not, you put that in front of the engineering manager or the finance director, and they'll go, right, that one, and that one, because they're all the shortest payback periods. And then you're left with all the dross that's 4.5-year payback period, and no one wants to invest in it. But also, it's not just a simple case of taking the shortest payback period projects and just doing them, because a lot of the projects are interrelated. If you think about what uses energy on a manufacturing site, it's utilities and the process, and those things are interlinked. And sometimes there might be a project, if you do that, you can't do another one. Or if you do one, it takes some savings away from the other, for example. So what we try and do is take all those opportunities, we sit down with the relevant people on site, so the various stakeholders. You might get somebody from engineering, from quality, from production, from finance, to understand the commercial aspects. And you assess each project on these merits, these different merits. And it's not just about payback period and the CapEx. It's about things like complexity. How difficult is it to implement that project? What's the operational risk of doing it? Does it need a shutdown? Because it might be a very simple project to do, but if you're not shutting down for 2 years, you can't do it for 2 years. You know? And then what we do is actually, and I'm sorry because these are quite small, but you basically rank and rate them on all these different criteria and give them a prioritization score. And then you set out a strategy. You've got all your different impacts, and you decide which one's most important for you. And then this is a 3 or 4 or 5 year plan. And it really helps, one, get buy-in from the business, because you can tell your finance director when you need to use capital, invest the capital over that plan. So you can put it into your capital plan, but also you can start budgeting for the savings as well. So it really helps with budgeting, it helps with capital planning, and these are some of the things that actually stop projects happening, is the capital planning and all that sort of stuff. And if you got buy-in from the finance director and he's going to give you this money, then you've got the funding to do the projects. And if you haven't, there are, as I say, there are lots of other ways to skin a cat in terms of funding projects. And then, just as importantly, is tracking performance on an ongoing basis, because you might have a 5-year plan, and in year one you do all the year one projects that you'd identified, but unless you go back to the business and say, look, this was successful, we've saved some money, we've saved the money that we said we were going to save, you won't get the next set of capital, because they're saying, well, we're not seeing the return unless you're actually demonstrating that you're meeting the savings. So the M&V afterwards is again just as important, if not more important, than the implementation itself. And as I say, this all comes down to the smart buildings type of technologies and the monitoring and targeting portals that everyone's got. It's getting that data back, making sure you monitor it on an ongoing basis, and also, more often than not, when you put a project in, you do a business case, you can only really roughly calculate what it's going to save within, plus or minus 5%, let's say. And then we quite often, if we're doing the M&V afterwards, see some additional benefit through optimization. So you can actually save more than the business case. And I showed this before, but the important thing is this is not a simple front-to-end process. Once you get to here and you're doing M&V, you start back again. You do another energy audit, or energy review, let's call it. Let's not call them audits. Energy review. And it's constant, continual improvement, and that is the ISO 50001 model. And that's why it's a really good idea to implement it, even if you don't get the certification. You don't have to pay the £8,000 or £10,000 it is to get the certificate. Just put the management system in place and you will save energy and reduce carbon. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And so we'll jump to the other side of it, and Gary's going to now, Gary Shanahan from Bays, will go to the reporting side, which is obviously equally important, particularly as there's not teeth, but they're leaning on you, let's put it that way. Gary.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the opportunity this afternoon. I'm Gary Shanahan. I'm in the Business Energy Use team in BEIS, where I'm responsible for a number of business and industrial energy efficiency policies and programmes, CRC, ESOS, climate change agreements, industrial heat recovery, and a number of others. But today I'm going to focus on, as a starter, SECR and CRC. So hopefully most of you are aware that some things are happening in March in terms of this is the end of emissions being covered under CRC. So this is the last phase of CRC, and legislation came into force in October that makes this the last phase of CRC. Covers emissions to the end of March 2019, but still requires organisations to report by the end of July this year and settle up the final allowances by October. That's aligned with changes that Treasury have put in place, and probably a new acronym, UTLAR, is the Overview of Taxation, Legislation and Rates, that's published alongside the budget that gave the new CCL rates that come into force this year and for the next 2 years as a result of the CRC revenue being spread across all CCL payers. And the legislation that brings in streamlined energy and carbon reporting was made on the 6th of November and comes into force on the 1st of April. And by 1st of April, it's for if your company or limited liability partnership, the first financial reports for years starting on or after the 1st of April. And I'll go on to say something about the link between SECR and ESOS. Both schemes will work in together in the same way that CRC and ESOS did. So just because SECR is coming in doesn't mean that ESOS isn't moving forward. And I'll also say something, there are differences in terms of the eligibility under both of the schemes. So I'm not going to talk you through this detail, but I'm just going to talk through some of the differences, particularly where SECR has different approaches, whether you're a quoted company or whether you're an unquoted company or limited liability partnership. The guidance document was published on the 31st of January that sets out in a lot more detail than the 10 minutes that I've got will allow me to do, but has updated the environmental reporting guidance that covered company reporting, and particularly under mandatory greenhouse gas reporting, but also goes into things like waste and water. But it's been updated to include streamlined energy and carbon reporting, and is that link there if you haven't seen it. So quoted companies, what they will be required to do is essentially build on the mandatory greenhouse reporting that they would have been doing for quoted companies of all sizes in the UK since 2013. So in the director's report for quoted companies on the main market of the London Stock Exchange and certain other European and North American markets, you needed to include your Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions and Scope 3 on a voluntary basis, the methodology you have used to calculate those emissions, and an intensity metric. What SECR adds for quoted companies is the requirement to also add detail on the global energy use that underpins those emissions calculations, and also what energy efficiency action you as an organisation have taken in the 12 months that are covered by the annual report. So again, this is about looking at what, for example, have you done with your ESOS recommendations in the last year, and if you're in an ISO 50001, what have you done to deliver your annual continuous improvement, are the kind of key actions that you would be able to disclose. You should also disclose, or it will be fairly obvious if you have a blank space on what energy efficiency action you have taken. It's probably not the best thing for organisations to want to do that. So for unquoted companies, this only applies to large unquoted UK incorporated companies and large limited liability partnerships, who will be required in the director's report, similar to the quoted companies or the limited liability partnerships who don't have a director's report, so they will have a specific energy and carbon report you're required only to report on a UK basis your energy use and the associated emissions. As a minimum, you can go further, and the minimum energy use is defined as, in the regulations, essentially as electricity and gas that derive from what you would generally have been reporting under CRC in the most recent days, and the transport for which you're responsible, which should come from your ESOS requirements. You're also required, as quoted companies, to include an intensity metric and the energy efficiency action you've taken and the methodology you've used. So when I mentioned there are kind of differences between SCCR and ESOS, one of those is how large is defined. And because the legislation for this derives from the Companies Act, we've taken to be consistent with the Companies Act definition of large, which is set out there as at least two of the three thresholds there. So 250 employees, 18 million balance sheet, 36 million turnover. If you only have 250 employees and don't meet the other thresholds, then you're not in scope of SCCR for that financial year. But just to be clear, also, if you're public sector, that doesn't necessarily mean you're exempt, because public sector organisations may have within their structures limited companies or limited liability partnerships that will be large enough to qualify in their own right for SCCR. You don't need to do that, the reporting electronically. It's voluntary, and that was partly because the rest of the Companies Act does not yet require mandated electronic reporting. So we didn't want energy and carbon to be different from other elements of financial reporting or annual reports by organisations. And there are some areas where we've brought in where there are reasons you may not need to disclose all the energy and carbon information, and those are if it is seen as seriously prejudicial to the company. And again, we set out a bit of guidance on that in the guidance, where the Financial Reporting Council, who are responsible for the enforcement of this, the SCCR and companies' accounts regime, see that as truly exceptional circumstances that would need to be justified, where the information is not practical to obtain and may not be particularly material, that doesn't justify it being cost effective to collect that information, or if an organisation or at a group level uses 40 megawatt hours of less of energy in the reporting, and that threshold is generally consistent with the ESOS threshold, where small energy users are defined as those that use less than 40 megawatt hours in a year. And if your director's report is reported at a group level, as set out in the Part 15 of the Companies Act, you will need to include all the subsidiaries that would qualify of their own right. You do not need to include parts of the group that in isolation would not meet the large thresholds if they're unquoted. And I guess another thing we've been asked questions on, and I guess it ties into ESOS, what we're not saying for SCCR is that you need formally to have third-party external assurance or verification. We set it out as good practice, and there will be a number of organisations, for example, that use ISO 50001, CDP, or other greenhouse gas protocol or other external verification, but that's not a requirement of the legislation. There will be parts of your audit of your company's accounts where, in preparing those and the director's report, the auditor will want to have take a view on, are there elements of that overall report that, having seen the SCCR information, is it consistent with the financial statements, for example, are all the kind of things that they will want to do, and is there anything material that they would want to flag? So ESOS, I'm not going to say a lot, but just to say, hopefully most people are aware that Phase 2 is now underway. The qualification date was, are you large, as defined in the ESOS regs? So 250 employees and or slightly different balance sheet and turnover thresholds. But it's only, if you have 250 employees, you will still be in no matter what your balance sheet or turnover, so that's different than SECR. ISO 50001, we've made some changes in some legislation we laid just before November, which was part of the suite of, in the unlikely event of a no deal statutory instruments, we included some legislation that now allow ISO 50001 2018 to be a valid compliance route. The previous ESOS regs just applied to 2011. Just in terms of phase one, our call was about 10% of organisations used ISO 50001 as their compliance route. And to remind you that the compliance deadline for you to confirm to the Environment Agency on the portal and to include who's in that compliance notification by the 5th of December this year. And I guess I know I've not got much time, but I guess just to flag that there's some other things happening in this space. So there's the Industrial Energy Accelerator that's looking at how can we bring forward near-market technologies into this space, 9.2 million available. An Industrial Heat Recovery Support Scheme that's available now, 18 million of funding to cover capital and feasibility studies on how you might make better use of the heat in industry. Climate change agreements, and it's actually one of BEIS's rather than an Ofgem one. We're currently evaluating the scheme with a view to what might come next, given we're now in the final target period of this current scheme. And hopefully most of you picked up in the budget, there was an announcement for a 315 million industrial energy transformation fund that covered industrial energy transformation, energy efficiency technologies, and longer-term decarbonisation. And final slide, some of the things that we're doing, and in some ways links to the previous session where we're looking at how best could small companies look at innovative business models to aggregate and scale up delivery of energy efficiency products. And again, another budget announcement where government has said that we will look at putting out a call for evidence sometime this year on a new business energy efficiency scheme that particularly looks at smaller businesses, because we're conscious the barriers for SMEs are quite different than those for the large companies. And a lot of our schemes are very much focused on large organisations rather than small. So their call for evidence will seek views on a range of possible delivery options. And that's enough from me. Thank you.
And finally, we'll introduce Arthur. I'll let Arthur introduce himself.
Thank you very much. I'm Arthur Probert, Commercial Director at Ameresco. I hope all of you are around this morning, so you heard sort of Dave speak, so I won't repeat that, but let us say that our interest in carbon arises not only in terms of sort of being part of this planet and wanting to be sustainable. We have clean, green and sustainable as our strapline. But also that we see that there are plenty of opportunities around for you to be able to take advantage and achieve carbon objectives which may well surpass those that are just intrinsically available. I'll talk about that a little bit later on, perhaps.
Thanks, Arthur. Over to yourselves. We've got a little time for some questions.
Regarding streamlined energy carbon reporting, don't make any more. The group criteria on it, when it's sort of alluded to that if any of the subsidiaries are large, then they would be communicating in their own right. Now, in ESOS, it made it reasonably clear, though it still took me a long time to get absolute clarity on it, that if you were a group and every part of your group was a small enterprise, then because nobody in the group was a large enterprise, you would be covered by ESOS. However, it doesn't seem to be very clear within the SECR that I've seen if your group as a whole has more than 250 employees and is therefore within that large category, but all of the members of that group, all of the companies within that group are small. None of them have over 250 employees and the associated turnovers and things like that. Do you classify from the group and that employee number, or since they're all small in their own right, do they all therefore not count?
So you will be required by the company's accounts legislation to provide a group director's report, but you will not be required to include in that group director's report, because the group director's report covers a whole host of other things, not just SECR, the information for those subsidiaries that do not qualify in their own right.
That's the answer I think you wanted to hear, Daniel. They don't qualify because they are separate entities, all as a group, and the group, because the group director doesn't have to report because they're individuals.
But just to be, I guess, just to be clear, while that's the kind of legal requirement, I think we still would, say best practice. Actually, if you are such a big group, there are benefits in putting that information out on a voluntary basis.
Okay. Richard.
Richard Eaton, Aggregate Industries. In our group directors report, we don't split out the financial information by each subsidiary company. So why is the streamlined energy and carbon reporting aspects of it going that step further? On one of your slides there, Gary, it said that we'd have to make those statements in relation to each company that qualifies. It seems like we're applying the old CRC significant group undertaking, which then became a participant equivalent, which just added complexity to the reporting. Why are we doing that? We're not doing that in terms of financial information. We just seem to be overly complicating and therefore not making it streamlined.
So, I guess we consulted on the detail here in terms of what would be required, and some organisations are saying we've got a whole host of subsidiaries that are small. Why do we need to report for them? Whereas there are others saying actually we are reporting and we would quite like to hold on to CRC groupings or ESOS groupings. We were trying to bring this into line with the rest of the company reporting landscape and leave it to organisations to make a call on how do they put that information in terms of do they best align with financial or other boundaries within that report. What we're just saying is you only need to include the information on those companies that are large in their own right. And that's the view we came to having take those decisions. We have, in terms of the complexity question, this aligns with the approach that's been in place through, MGHG reporting. So quoted companies no longer have to do an MGHG reporting and, if they're in CRC, a CRC report. So that's what we see as streamlining.
But I'm going to have to go to my CFO and explain that although we report the financial information for Aggregate Industries UK Limited, and we're actually going to have to report the energy and carbon figures by each of the large companies within the group. He's going to ask why. So is it a legislated requirement that we have to put separate statements in for each large company within the group?
Yes, you need to identify each organisation that is large enough so that what they would be required to do in isolation is met at a group level.
Great. One final question. Yep.
One of your slides had a minimum reporting requirement on energy as transport, gas and electricity. I think some companies in the room have got quite a large quantity of fuels that they energy requirement. Is it like an option to include that?
So, as I said, where we built up the SECR minimum requirements for were CRC, electricity and gas, and transport from ESOS. I think we recognise that there are organisations that will have other energy and emissions that are maybe quite material beyond those. We would say it's best practice for you to include those, and they will be collected as part of ESOS. But we sought views on what we should cover under SECR, and it was broadly not to go back to the early days of CRC, where there were 29 different fuel types that included a whole host of energy and other products. And, you know, taking the point about streamlining, that was why we drew the line on a minimum electricity, gas and transport.